Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. event here at the University of Florida. For those of you checking online, thank you, appreciate the support. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. David Canton. I'm the director of the African American Studies program here at the University of Florida. And I'd like to welcome you to the annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Talk. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, the Office of Black Student Engagement, the African American Studies program, and the Martin Luther King Day Committee for arranging the King holiday events. When we started meeting last semester to arrange this event for January. This year marks the 38th anniversary of the Dr. King holiday, and is celebrated a National Day of Service and not a day off. But for most Americans, Dr. King has been reduced to August 28, 1963, the I Have a Dream speech. Depending on who you talk to, one may have their own interpretation of Dr. King. For many conservatives, Dr. King believed in a colorblind society and was anti-affirmative action. Joe Biden will applaud Dr. King's commitment to nonviolence and the elimination of Jim Crow and segregation. And if you interview progressives, they will talk about King's anti-Vietnam War critique, anti-militarism, and anti-racism. When we commemorate Dr. King's holiday, who should we celebrate? So the bottom line is about interpretation. When you visit the King statue in DC, there are a number of King quotes, and not one quote includes the word racism. One may say, well, he didn't have any short quotes with the word racism because we know Black Baptist preachers can talk. Wrong. Here is a short one from his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? The roots of racism are very deep in America. Why was this quote omitted? Most Americans would like the sanitized version of King and not discuss his radical perspectives near the end of his life. In fact, King was cognizant of these issues during the Civil Rights Movement, but due to the Cold War pressure, he did not discuss economic issues in the country. So the sanitized version reduced King to the content of his character. But the words we talked about, the three evils, racism, militarism, capitalism, are silenced. Now here's a great example of how King is interpreted. In January 2021, the 1776 Commission report, which was published as a response to the 1619 Project, have a quote from King's I Have a Dream speech. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now that's the quote, but they left this out. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital, cash a check. This note, it is obvious today that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given its colored people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. You see how that works? So that was intentionally omitted, right, to support the thesis of the 1776 Commission. So when we think about King this week, his birthday's next week, always think about interpretation and read for yourself what King actually said and not what some people like you to think he said. That's the difference, right? All right, so today we have Dr. Jeffrey Okbar, and before we get to that, some housekeeping business. He is part of our Mellon Scholars Program Speaker Series. Last year received a $100,000 grant, and part of our grant is bringing in scholars to talk to our Mellon Scholars. And this year we have our 4 Mellon Scholars. Will they please stand, please? Don't be shy. Give them a hand, all right? So these students will receive a $1,000 scholarship. They will present at the National Council of Black Studies Conference in March. We're going out to San Jose, okay? They also be part of the Beyond 120 program here in the College of Law and Liberal Sciences. We had lunch with our speaker this semester, and they also received some good Mellon Scholars swag. So we're excited about working with these young people that have a faculty mentor. They also work with the graduate student who we just hired as well. So we're really excited about this program, really excited about the conference. We'll have another group cohort next year. If you're African Studies majors, we're looking for 8 students. So if you're a major, you could apply. It'll be the same thing. $1,000 scholarship, present at a conference. We go out to wherever the conference is gonna be, all paid for. You just have to buy your own souvenirs, okay? Keep that in mind. We ain't paying for souvenirs. All right, so let me start. Let me give the very brief bio. Now, Dr. Okbar and I, we go back to Morehouse College. So we're going on 30 plus years of knowing one another. Dr. Jeffrey O.G. Okbar is professor of history and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Popular Music. He is the author or editor of several books, including Black Power, Radical Politics and African-American Identity, Hip Hop Revolution, The Culture and Politics of Rap, a book that I'm using in my class this semester. He's gonna come to class and sign some books tomorrow afternoon. The Harlem Renaissance, Revisited Politics, Arts and Letters. In 2018, he released Keywords for African American Studies with co-editors Erica R. Edwards and Roderick A. Ferguson. Dr. Okbar's articles appear in the Journal of Religious Thought, Journal of Black Studies, Soul, Central, and Radical Society, among other academic publications. He has been invited to write for the New York Times, Room for Debate, and the Daily Beast, among other publications. His newest book, America's Black Capital, How African Americans Remade Atlanta in the Shadow of the Confederacy, is out with Basic Books. Raised in Los Angeles, California, Okbar received his BA in history from Morehouse College and his MA and PhD degrees in history from Indiana University. Well, let's welcome Dr. Jeffrey Okbar.
Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I never told David this. I don't think. First off, thank you, African American Studies program. Thank you, so many people, and the hard work putting this together. Fantastic meeting the students earlier today. Incredibly bright students in the Mellon program. Dr. Canton, generous as always. Thank you very much for the invitation. Glad to be part of the series. This is my very first time to Gainesville, and absolutely beautiful town and great weather. We just had a snowstorm in Connecticut all Sunday, so this is a nice break from all that. But I don't think I ever told you this, that when it came to graduate school, University of Florida was one of the schools that it was a contender. I got admitted, I was excited about, some warm climate. Indiana University gave me a little bit of money, a little bit more than Florida gave me, and I ended up being in Bloomington with a whole bunch of snow. So I've been around a lot of snow for a lot of years. It's always good to come back down to somewhere warm. And it's fantastic to be here in the middle of winter in a nice warm climate with warm spirits. I'm excited to talk about this topic here today. We're looking at Dr. King's hometown. And as Dr. King said, I'm from LA. And I was just mentioning earlier that my wife, however, will tell you that her husband is from Chicago. And the reason she says that is because she thinks Chicago is a much cooler city than Los Angeles. But I wear LA literally on my sleeve. Like I have Dodgers cufflinks on right now. The trade with Ohtani was a big deal. I'm a LeBron fan. I could go on and on about Los Angeles and what LA is to me and how much it shaped me as a person, right? And so in some ways, all of us, and this is a very pedestrian observation, but we're all consequences of our subjective experiences, right? So if you grew up in a very small town, you have a very different experience than someone growing up in Brooklyn, New York, right? And navigating Brooklyn, New York, from birth to college would be very different than navigating a small town in New Hampshire from birth through college. So the people you're exposed to, the ideas, the energy of the city, all these things shape us in a very indelible way. And the same can be said about Dr. King, and it may seem obvious. But when you think about all the people who've written about Dr. King, who's one of the most famous people ever in the last 20th century, in the 20th century, if you look at Dr. King, right, he has global name recognition. He's in one of the pantheon of American icons. world-renowned human rights icon. There are stamps made of Dr. King, streets named of Dr. King. There are statues of Dr. King all around the world, not just in the United States. There are people who study Dr. King and social justice all around the planet. And so when people think of the 20th century and thought leaders, anywhere in the world, in any language, when people talk about human rights and social justice, Dr. King is in the conversation. He's a global figure with incredible gravity, and we can't mistaken or overlook how important he is. When people talk about Dr. King as someone who has such significance in shaping global thought around justice and human rights and social change, people ask the question, who influenced Dr. King? What were the thought leaders that shaped how he saw the world? What people were put in his worldview, were put in front of him as a child, in college, as a young adult, that shaped the way he saw the world and the possibilities of humanity, right? Some people talk about his experience as a Morehouse man, as a man of the cloth. Of course, he was a Baptist minister. His father was a Baptist minister. His grandfather was a Baptist minister. His father was a Morehouse man. His grandfather was a Morehouse man. He was a Morehouse man. I'm a Morehouse man and I'm biased. Now, I'll talk about Morehouse a little bit in this talk, but it's because it's important, not because I'm biased. All that has a little bit to do with it. And he's a native son of Atlanta. What I want to do is think about a couple things. One, understanding Dr. King and understanding the different influences. For the sake of time, we can't go through all the different folks that shaped Dr. King's ideas, but we want to look at Atlanta also as a key element to how Dr. King's philosophies around race, about justice, about freedom, about the human condition, how Atlanta shaped him, and in an important way by extrapolating the world. So Atlanta, and you look at the title, King's Mecca, that comes from, in 1971, Ebony Magazine did a special issue. Ebony Magazine is a largest magazine for African-American lifestyle in the 20th century. And in 1971, it did a special issue after the civil rights movement had declined and in the middle of the Black Power movement. It did a special story on the South. And Ebony Magazine said, hey, we're entering a new decade. This is the very first decade in the history of the United States of America where people are not denied access to voting, to housing, to education, to healthcare by law, right? The country's been around since 1776, not counting the colonial period. And this is the very first decade in the country's history. And the place where the hostility to freedom, democracy, and opportunity was most acute was the South. So let's revisit the South and see what the South looks like now in 1971, right? And they did this special issue. They looked at different cities in the South. They looked at all kinds of cities. And they looked at Atlanta. And they looked at Atlanta and said, Atlanta, Georgia is special. It's the place where Black folks do better, where they interact with white people better, they have more, they live longer, better, more lush lives. It is, in fact, the Black Mecca. And it's the very first time we hear the term Black Mecca applied to Atlanta. And it's a very important term. It becomes the term that people would associate with the city ever since. There are articles and books written about it. When Black Panther came out in 2018, all sorts of people refer to Atlanta as Wakanda. If you Google Atlanta and Wakanda, you'll see all kinds of articles and blogs where people talk about Atlanta being a veritable Wakanda. And so people have sort of seen Atlanta as a special city and a Black Mecca. So between 1980 and 2024, no metro area in the United States of America has drawn more Black migrants than Atlanta. Atlanta went from, say, around 2000, number 9 in large metros. The Black folks have gone there so high that there's only one metro with more Black people. That's New York City, with more Black people than the metropolitan area of Atlanta. There are 2 million Black folks that live around Atlanta. The core city has about 500,000 people. Atlanta is starting right now, this month, Atlanta is going 50 years unbroken. It's the very first city in the United States of America to have 50 years unbroken Black mayors, right, in City Hall. Newark had a Puerto Rican acting mayor for a period, but Washington, D.C. came later, and you've had every major city, many major cities, not every, but many have had Black mayors, but Atlanta is the only one now to go a half a century with unbroken line of Black mayors. The busiest airport in the planet is in Atlanta. It's been for over 18 years now. The Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport generates billions of dollars, employs 63,000 people. The busiest airport on earth has been under executive black management since the 1980s. Unbroken line, black people from the very top all the way down have been about 75% of people who work there are black. Black people, I could go through this whole list of data. The last couple I'll say is that the city now, the percentage of black people has declined. The percentage is around 50% or so. 75% of the school teachers are black. Majority of police officers are black. Majority of firefighters are black. About 80% of people working in City Hall and Fulton County government are black. Black people are overrepresented in a way that you don't see in any other major city in the United States of America, right? So this is Atlanta of 2024, right? King's hometown. But what was Atlanta like when King was around? King was born in 1929. In 1929, we're gonna give a quick little overview of the kind of world that King saw in Atlanta. It didn't look like Atlanta in 2024. The Metro Atlanta didn't look like Metro Atlanta now. So we're gonna do a quick walkthrough. Atlanta's been known by many names. I would love to talk about this. You know how Dr. Ken talked about how Baptist ministers love to talk. If you know any professor, we can give them a run for their money. So I love to talk. I love to talk about my scholarship in particular. So I will have to skip through a whole bunch of things that I find really fascinating. But one thing a lot of people don't know is that when the Civil War began and Southern states started to secede, they were looking for a capital. And they were like, hey, we need a new capital. To hell with Washington, D.C., we need a federal capital. And so they got together and looked at different places in the South, and there were a couple finalists, Richmond, Virginia, and Atlanta, Georgia. So Atlanta almost became the capital of the Confederacy. While it didn't become the capital of the Confederacy, it became a centerpiece to the war machinations. It became the heart of the war machine. And when Sherman's troops came into Atlanta in the spring of 1864 and were penetrating into Atlanta in the summer of 64, the governor was scared. He was shaking in his boots. He probably soiled his drawers. He was crying and whimpering and couldn't sleep. And he called for help. And he said, we need to keep Atlanta. It is to the Confederacy what the heart is to the human body, right? This is how important Atlanta is. And when Sherman captured Atlanta, Lincoln, who was about to lose his reelection campaign in 1864, won by a landslide. Atlanta literally saved in so many ways. And this sounds like it's hyperbolic. And I talk about this in the book. But Atlanta in so many ways was critical to the outcome of the war. Fast forward after the desolation of Atlanta, Atlanta comes up, sees itself as you guys know the phoenix, right? Emerges from fire. So Atlanta adopts the phoenix, the bird that comes out of fire, and said, we're a new city. We have a resurgence, and we're now the capital of the New South. There's a guy named Henry Grady. He went around the country and said, everyone, come to Atlanta. We're the capital of the New South. We're an industrial city. We're forward-looking. We're progressive. We don't hold grudges. Come down here. You can ball out. You can have fun. It's a great place, right? We definitely maintain the subjugation of certain people, but it's all good. Y'all do the same thing other places. This is a nice spot. Come down here, enjoy yourself in Atlanta. And the capital of the New South in 1915 went through a process again. And in 1915, there was the establishment of a new Ku Klux Klan. There was a movie that came out, Birth of a Nation. It inspired these people to go back to some old neo-Confederate politics. They said, we're going to create the Ku Klux Klan all over again. And there's a little suburb of Atlanta called Stone Mountain. They went out there, reestablished the Klan in November of 1915. Spread like wildfire all across the United States. The Klan became so big, estimations of membership in every single state and even branched out to Canada. The Klan had become so large, the majority of the congressional delegation from Georgia were Klans members. In the 1920s, the mayor, Walter Sims, was an explicit card-carrying Klan member. Herbert Jenkins, who was a police officer, by his own admission, he says that when he became a police officer in Atlanta, you became a police officer and a Klansman almost at the exact same time. It's like you paid your dues, you became a police officer. The New York Times estimates that about 40,000 Klansmen saturated the city of Atlanta, which is probably an overestimate, could be 20,000 or so, half that amount, but you're talking about 20,000 people belonging to a terrorist organization in your city is quite frightening, right? And the majority of the police officers were 100% white. Atlanta, like other cities, did not believe in fairness or meritocracy, or someone didn't get a job because of their talent. Race, of course, predicted all these things, and people with that, you could be the smartest, most capable police officer, or possible police officer in the world, but you weren't going to get a job because this is how Atlanta was. It was a white nationalist project. This is the decade where King takes his first breath in Atlanta, in the 1920s. The Klan was so big in Atlanta that it was actually called the Imperial City for the Ku Klux Klan. So people came in from all around the country. I know y'all have heard legends about a documentary. Some of y'all in the audience have heard legends about a documentary called Freaknik that's been in the works, right? So it was a raucous time in Atlanta in the 1990s and 1980s where young college people came in all the way to the city of Atlanta to party and revel and have a good time. And it was wild and chaotic, but people had a field day. It was called Freaknik. So in the 1920s, the Klan had their own Freaknik. So people came in from all around the United States, thousands of people, revelers that came downtown. Y'all should Google Freaknik, and y'all will be like, dang, Dr. Oakbar was wilding out. But these people came down, and the Klan had parties in the streets. They sold out all the hotels. They were making money hand over fist in Atlanta. The Klan was so big in Atlanta. Not only was a mayor in the Klan, not only were the police officers in the Klan, Coca-Cola's world headquarters were in Atlanta. And the Coca-Cola was like, yo, the Klan, these dudes are the real deal. Let's take out ads in the Klan newspaper. Let's take out as many big ads. And in fact, every time they come down here for their Klan Freaknik, we want to make sure that we have Coca-Cola out there for these Klansmen, right? We want them to buy Coca-Cola, right? This is a good thing for us, right? So the Klan was so huge. Atlanta was so hostile to black people that when the decade of the 1920s started, Atlanta had a number of public high schools where African Americans paid taxes to support. All of those high schools barred African Americans. No black person in the city of Atlanta could attend any public high school. In the state of Georgia, there were no public high schools available for any black person in the start of the 1920s. It was not until 1924 the very first black public high school emerged in Atlanta. It's called Booker T. Washington High School, 5 years before Dr. King was born, right? 1920 is here's a fancy word, insalubrious environment. And this is the world that Dr. King was born into. When we think about the Imperial City for the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, Dr. King, of course, is born in 1929. He's experiencing the sort of the warm afterglow of the Ku Klux Klan and its denouement. And by the 1950s, and this is when things get a little wild, Atlanta adopts a new moniker. Atlanta, in 1959, in the middle of the civil rights movement, the mayor, of course, a white mayor, is William Hartsfield. He said, he looks at the world, and all of us in this room have seen images from the civil rights movement. All of us have seen images of the little girl trying to go through a throng of red-faced, spitting, hateful people in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957, right? People yelling and all this kind of stuff, and she's terrified. People have seen pictures of little Ruby, was it Ruby Davis? The little girl, Bridges, thank you, Ruby Bridges in New Orleans walking with federal marshals, right? Hateful people around and everything. We've seen images of Montgomery, Alabama, right? Everyone in this room knows Rosa Parks, and everyone in this room knows that people didn't relent and say, hey, you know what? It's wrong that we should, discriminate and all this kind of stuff. But they fought with great tenacity against the idea that any person can be treated fairly in the bus system of Montgomery, right? They hated the idea, right? And we know about Montgomery, we know about Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, 16th Street Baptist Church, terrorist bombing, 4 little girls. Atlanta, we don't have any of those images, right? We don't have any images of little kids being beat up and tortured and spat upon. We don't have any images of churches being blown up. We don't have any of these images at all. The mayor of Atlanta said in 1959, Atlanta is a city too busy to hate. He went back to what my man said, it's the New South and that we're full of energy and industriousness and forward looking. He said, Atlanta, we're not about that life. We're out here trying to be prosperous, right? We're trying to make money. We're trying to, have a nice time. We're trying to invite revelers down here to party, right? The Klan had Freaknik. Maybe in the future, there'll be a Freaknik for black people. I don't know. So he was like, Atlanta's a great place. So Atlanta, according to Mayor Hartsfield, in 1959 was a city too busy to hate. But let's look at the numbers here. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the science. Let's see if the math matched, right? It turns out, if you look at Atlanta in 1959 through to 1969, when Dr. King is assassinated. 1968, he's assassinated. But let's look at a good, 9-year swath. Turns out that Atlanta desegregated its buses over a year after Montgomery, and only after pressure from the local NAACP forced it through the court system. It integrated its schools after Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, after Little Rock, Arkansas. In fact, by the 1960s, of all the school districts in the United States of America, there was one school district in the South that integrated its schools at a slower rate than Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta was behind all these states, all these cities. To everyone's surprise, whenever I tell them this, Birmingham, Alabama, we call it Bombingham. There's a part of the city called it Dynamite Hill because there were so many terrorist bombings. There were more terrorist bombings in Atlanta than Birmingham, Alabama, right? And so the thing is, like, how is it that we have this idea of Atlanta being this progressive city, the city too busy to hate, when in fact you have more terrorist bombings in Birmingham, the buses are integrated after Montgomery, the schools are integrated after Little Rock and every other city in the United States of America except for one little small city. So how do we have this mesmerizing myth? This is King's hometown, right? And so now let's see how this shapes Dr. King's life before we get to the Black Mecca, right? I'm going to read a little bit here. I think many of us are unaware that Dr. King used to be a singer. Let's see this. Few people know that Martin Luther King Jr., the nation's most iconic civil and human rights leader, was once a singer. In December 1939, as a precocious 10-year-old child, I put my glasses on. I thought it was slick out here reading like I could actually see things in 20/20 vision. The precocious 10-year-old child of a middle-class family, he joined his classmates in the biggest performance of their lives to that point. They were part of the boys' choir at Ebenezer Baptist Church, one of the most prominent black churches in Atlanta. His maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, the former senior pastor of the church, helped establish the first branch of the NAACP in the city. Williams, his grandfather, was succeeded as by pastor. His son-in-law, Mr. or Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. The young King was raised in a veritable oasis of black comfort in Sweet Auburn, the area once known as Shermantown. Many of the newly freed people after the Civil War had gravitated to the camp, and in their search for safety from Confederate violence, they formed a shantytown in the ruins of the fires that burned much of the city. Out of sheer industriousness against extraordinary opposition, these formerly enslaved people created a storied neighborhood anchored in an array of black-owned institutions, restaurants, medical and law offices, theaters, churches, a bank, and an insurance company. By 1956, as King was leading his very first civil rights campaign, the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, Fortune magazine identified Auburn Avenue as, quote, the richest Negro street in the world. Still, on that night in 1939, King marveled at the opulence in the room before him. Although the young King had witnessed professional black men and women, those who lived in Victorian homes, some of whom had maids, this affair was quite different. He had never seen extravagance like this high society gathering. The Junior League Ball was a conspicuous display of wealth, not just bourgeois comfort. He peered into the crowd of well-dressed, chatting faces. There was an energy and excitement that swept the city, and it seemed to pervade the room as well. Even children were not immune to the sense that this was a major event. On December 13th, the day before 10-year-old King's performance, the city of Atlanta had begun the first of 3 days of the most extravagant festivities in the city's history. Governor Rivers declared December 15th the state holiday as hundreds of thousands of people poured into the state capitol for the culmination of celebrations, which included a 7-mile parade of limousines, bands, and dignitaries. Mayor William B. Hartsfield boasted to guests that the city was a gateway to the future, while simultaneously enjoying a rich Southern history of plantations, red clay hills, and the romantic cliches of antebellum Dixie. Grinning slaves, pedestalized Southern belles, and proud planters included. It was also a city that was modern, cosmopolitan, and civilized enough to host an event of this magnitude. Atlanta, in December of 1939, was proud to showcase itself to the throngs of tourists who filled hotel rooms to capacity and crowded its streets. There were dozens of parties, including debutante balls with belles in hoop skirts and parasols. Thousands of Confederate flags marked the city. clutched in the hands of partygoers, hung from walls, and hoisted above the heads of children, swept throughout the festivities. Future President of the United States, Georgia native Jimmy Carter, who was 15 years old, noted that, quote, "This was the biggest event to happen in the South in my lifetime," unquote. The celebrations culminated in the world premiere of the film Gone with the Wind. Though based on a historical novel that centers the South in a generally sympathetic light, the movie version of Gone with the Wind provided an even broader audience with lush visual representations of an imagined community of white Southerners who pledged fidelity to a rebel cause. This cause was in clear defiance to the country of their birth, but the rebels redefined the boundaries of their native land. Theirs stopped at the Mason-Dixon line. In reality, the Confederate States of America led millions of white Southerners in a treasonous pro-slavery war that cost more American lives than any conflict before or after. One of the things that happened in 1939, Dr. King, at the time, little boy King, little Martin King at 10 years old, he was in the church choir and the organizers of the Junior League Ball, which is the all-white women elite group in the South at the time. And it may not have been constricted to the South, but it had a chapter in Atlanta, and they wanted to do a celebration for the movie, and they wanted to have a Southern antebellum Old South theme. And they said come in as, they actually dressed up as Southern belles and as planters, and they wanted to have a whole bunch of slaves. They said, this will not be finished, this will not be complete unless we have a whole bunch of Negroes that come in here as slaves. So they're like, where do we find a bunch of Negro slaves? And so they said, let's go reach out to this church here. They went to Ebenezer Baptist Church. They went to the church and said, we will love your choir. Come on here, we'll give y'all some money, make a donation to the church, and we dress y'all up. Y'all grin, look real happy, and you're gonna be some grinning slaves. And that's how Dr. King, or Boy King, this little child, long before he got his PhD, was a singer at this event. What's important here is that Dr. King, when his memory of Atlanta and the world in which denied him access to parks and schools and the Central Library and a whole bunch of other things, it was his hometown. He saw the hometown up close in the most ugly ways. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about these things, but it's really important how much it shaped the possibility of Atlanta. Excuse me, Dr. King. The last thing I'll say is that when we think of cities, we have to also think about cities. I'm gonna have a quote here from you about how we imagine cities and what we think of when we think of cities, as I show you a little bit more about King's life. This quote is from Ling Ma, who's a novelist, and her famous novel, Severance, which came out a few years ago, and she writes about the city. She says, "To live in a city is to live the life that it was built for, to adapt to its schedule and rhythms, to move within the transit layout made for you during the morning and evening rush, winding through the crowds of fellow commuters. To live in a city is to consume its offerings, to eat at its restaurants, to drink at its bars, to shop at its stores." People shape the city, and the city will shape people. We're all shaped by our surroundings. Our cities are not, this is my words here, these are my words here. Our cities are not simply fixed spaces of buildings and schools and offices, parks, without inflections of human character. They are animated by the people, good and bad. These institutions are healthy, or they can be toxic. They can be kind, or they can be cruel. They can be generous, or they can be stingy. And Dr. King experienced much of that. So when we think about these cities, I'm gonna isolate our conversation not to the churches, although the churches are very important to King's development, but I'm gonna actually look at where he saw school and where he decided that his life, with the direction he would go after enrolling at Morehouse College. And I'll state this quickly, that in the summer of 1944, while World War II was going on, Morehouse College, an all-male school, like many schools, suffered and struggled with its enrollment, as many people were serving in the war. Morehouse College decided to let in high school students, particularly talented high school kids, in early. And Dr. King was one of those that came in early at 15 years old. He enrolled at Morehouse College. In September of 1944, he began his studies at the school where his father and his maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, attended. And his years were characterized by what people have called middling academic performance. His experience in the classroom set him, however, on a path that led to his ministry and struggle for civil rights. At Morehouse College, he met a president who had been in there for 4 years, Benjamin Elijah Mays. And Dr. Mays was a native son of the South, He's from South Carolina. He went to the University of Chicago for his PhD. He became an intellectual giant, a mentor, and according to Dr. King, his spiritual father and his intellectual father. Dr. Mays is, as every Morehouse man will tell you, is the most celebrated president of our beloved alma mater. And people talk about Dr. Mays with great reverence. King characterized Mays in the ways I mentioned before, and King was distinguished in many ways at the college by having weekly addresses to the students. And in these weekly addresses to students, he implored them to demand more of their lives and to demand more of their place in the world. And he introduced them to ideas. He talked about social justice. He was a voracious reader, an academic, someone who had navigated many different circles. He traveled internationally, and his curiosity around issues of social justice brought him to India. He was fascinated by Mahatma Gandhi. He came back to the United States. He talked about Gandhi and Gandhian notions in school at his lectures. It was there that Dr. King was first introduced to Mahatma Gandhi and the ideas around justice. This affected King in really important ways, and Dr. Mays himself would talk about the closeness that he had with Dr. King and his family. Mays visited King and his parents at their home and became a regular guest at the family's Sunday dinners. According to King, his ministerial aspirations were deeply influenced by Dr. Mays at Morehouse. And there was a professor there who also influenced Dr. King. It turns out that although Dr. King's father was a minister and his grandfather was a minister, Dr. King's father was not hoping for his son to follow in his footsteps. Daddy King actually was hoping that his son would become a physician or a lawyer. And Dr. King, in many ways, he was like, well, I'm kind of thinking about being a lawyer. Maybe I'll be a physician. Then he decided, because he was so close to Dr. Mays, he was so close to another professor named Dr. Kelsey, George Kelsey, who did his undergrad at Morehouse as well, and then got a PhD from Yale, and then was a professor at Morehouse. Dr. Kelsey's class was the only class at Morehouse College that Dr. King earned an A in the 4 years he was at Morehouse. He got one single A, and that was in Dr. Kelsey's class. Dr. Kelsey wrote a letter for him, and he said that, and he talked about how Dr. King was strong in many ways, although he had not maximized his intellectual capacity. But in these two mentors, he saw the possibility of being an academic. And so Dr. King was, King was like, I don't want to be a minister, I don't want to be a lawyer or physician, I want to get a PhD and become a professor. And that's what I'll do in life. I'll become a professor, I'll come back, I'll one day be president of Morehouse College like my mentor, Dr. Mays. And that was his career ambition. But at Atlanta, in this institution, he found himself being exposed to other ideas. And he said this about Professor Kelsey and Dr. Mays. He said, quote, I could see in their lives the ideal that I wanted to be a minister. And he said in a 1956 interview. And he mentioned that his intellectual life was blossoming in really important ways. In this one sermon, Mastering Our Fears, it was written 9 years after King graduated. He pulled heavily from Dr. Mays' own teachings and how much it shaped his life in indelible ways. When he was a student at Morehouse College and going into his junior year, the summer before he started his junior year, the little young man who at this point was about 17 years old, in a letter, he summarized the goals of black citizens in the state of Georgia, and then throughout the South, and then throughout the country. He said, we want, and this is a letter he wrote to the Atlanta Constitution. There are two major newspapers, the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. And this little kid who's still a teenager, as a student at Morehouse, was so affected by Dr. Mays and Dr. Kelsey that he started to grapple with notions of social justice and activism and doing something bigger and bolder and more. And he said, we want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. This is the king of the teenager talking. The right to earn a living and to work for which we are fitted by training and ability, equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, and similar public services, the right to vote, equality before the law, some of the same courtesy and good manners that we ourselves bring to all human relations. So Dr. Little King here at this point had become someone who was slowly but surely becoming an activist. And in January of 1947, a few months later, he wrote in the Maroon Tiger newspaper, the student paper at Morehouse College, still called the Maroon Tiger to this day. He said this. This is, again, the teenager King. At this point, he's 18 years old. He's still, at this point, he's just about to turn 18 years old. He says, the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensely and to think critically. But education, which stops with efficiency, may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals. The late Eugene Talmadge, a horrible, vicious, racist governor of Georgia, he said, in my opinion, possessed one of the better minds of Georgia, or even America, King said. Moreover, he wore a Phi Beta Kappa key, this elite honor society. By all measuring rods, Mr. Talmadge could think critically and intensively, yet he contends that I am an inferior being. Are those types of men the ones we call educated? The boy King said. We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The complete objection of education gives one not just power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. The broad education will, therefore, transmit to one not only the accumulated knowledge of the race, but also the accumulated experience of social living. If we are not careful, our colleges, King said, will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. So this King was being shaped indelibly by the experiences of people at this institution in Atlanta, which itself was shaped by being in Atlanta and being shaped by being in Georgia. A very, very hostile space. A hostile space to Black life, a hostile space to justice, a hostile space to democracy, a hostile space to freedom. And so with the leadership of people like Dr. Mays, inextricably tied to a current of freedom, of justice, of the international sensibilities around human rights, that this pervaded the college at Morehouse. This pervaded the teaching, the pedagogy, right? The curriculum at Morehouse was shaped by it in so many important ways. It shaped these students, and King himself was shaped by it. King would go on to write about his experiences and how important it was for him. What I want to do is also read a little bit about the world that Atlanta was in the 1940s, and then I'm gonna bring it to a close by talking about how King was shaped also by something I call Afro self-determinism. And this is this belief that African Americans can create institutions for by and about themselves without being hostile to others, without being necessarily hostile to integration. So if you bear with me for a second, I'm gonna give you in 2 minutes, a quick rundown a way that political theory and people who've looked at African American history and political thought, we've broken up this in sort of different camps, right? And some of these historical figures you'd be familiar with. So we have a sort of an integrationist drive, right? Someone like Frederick Douglass, at one point, Du Bois earlier in his life, Dr. King, people say that there are people who've argued that African Americans should be fully woven into the fabric of the United States, much in the way that European ethnic groups have been woven into the fabric of the United States, right? But there are laws that are unlike law. There were no laws saying that Irish could not vote. There were no laws saying that Jewish people could not vote. There were no laws saying that these groups of people could not attend an all-white school or be part of the all-white military. So the all-white military had whites of all sorts of ethnic groups, right? There were no Black people in all-white military. And so they said we wanted to be included into the fabric the way these European ethnic groups have been included into the fabric of the United States. There's another position, a Black nationalist position. And the Black nationalist position is the opposite of this. The so-called father of Black nationalism is Martin Delany in the 19th century, and he said that Black people get their freedom not by integrating, but separating and creating their own nation state, their own individual country. So Marcus Garvey would be in that tradition, the Nation of Islam, early Malcolm X. So when we think of someone saying they want to create their own Black country separate away from the United States, independent Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Black people in the money, Black people everything, all Black everything, independent territory, all that, right? So that's the other line. Then you have a little small conservative position, best exemplified by, take someone like Clarence Thomas or Booker T. Washington, accommodationist position. That, the system itself is extant. You can make the best you can within it. You don't need to cause a ruckus, activism, separating, trying to do something else, all that's ridiculous. You could do a whole bunch with what you have right here, your resources. And then there's a position that people call the radical Black tradition. And the radical Black tradition is embodied by late Malcolm X, late W.E.B. Du Bois, and the Black Panther Party. And the position really is that you have a system, we can either integrate into the system, but the system is ethically and morally flawed, right? Economically flawed. It's flawed with militarism. It's flawed with imperialism. And so at best, we can integrate into the system and we'll be 13% of the people dropping bombs in some or invading some country. We'll be 13% of the elite. We'll be 13% of the poor, 13% of the people mass incarcerated, right? So that's the ideal integrated system, and we don't want to integrate into a system like that. right? Or we could be like the nationalists, separate from it, and be like Garvey and everybody else, create our own country somewhere else. But what's going to stop that corrupt system from going and bombing it, right? If they go all around the world and bomb people in Vietnam, then what's going to stop them from bombing us over in Africa or wherever else we create a place, right? So we're not going to accommodate the system like Booker T. Washington just sit on our hands. So what we need to do is have a fundamental overhaul of the system, economically, politically, morally, socially, overhaul that system and create something new in this place that's humane and ethical to its core, right? That's the radical black tradition. And one might say that the late Dr. King is part of that as well. But then there's a last line that I argue is really important, often overlooked, and that is the sort of Afro self-determinist position. And this is a position that believes that black people will fundamentally be best advanced, not by trying to send this is from this period, up to the Civil Rights Movement. There's General Sherman, when he made his way to Savannah, met a group of freed people, and he said, "What do you guys want?" And he said, we're loyal to the United States first. We don't want to go to some other country. First off, we are here, born here, we live here, this is our country. But we do not feel that we have to be around these white Southerners. I'm gonna keep it real. We don't feel this need to be, we feel like we'll be better off if we have our own land, own space, and everything else, right? But we believe in the federal government and we are loyal to our country, but we want to have protection if we create institutions for by and about ourselves. So he was like, bet, you know what I'm going to do for you? He said, what? 40 acres, bam. And he's like, what? Throw a mule in there too. Go ahead, 40 acres and a mule. And that's how we got 40 acres and a mule, right? And so this actually comes out of this belief that black people could in fact create something by, for, and about themselves. Schools, churches, social organizations, all these things. And people didn't have any kind of problem with this. It turns out that Atlanta, Dr. King's hometown, was the best example of Afro self-determinism. It manifested itself in every city across the United States, but there was something acute in Atlanta. More than any city in America, Atlanta had the concentration of higher education for black folks. They had more black schools than any city in the United States of America. Spelman, Morehouse, Morris Brown, Clark, Atlanta University, Gammon Theological Seminary. They had all these schools there, right? These people went there, they stayed there, they created businesses, they had insurance companies. Some people got very, very wealthy in these schools, and they had all these amazing churches. And they had construction companies, and then they had banks. And although people talk about Harlem, and people love talking about Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, like Harlem was this, Harlem's that, turns out that Auburn Avenue outstripped Harlem in black-owned businesses, although Harlem was a much bigger city. It was a section of a city, right? New York City in the 1920s was probably about, in 1920, the beginning of the decade, was maybe about 4%, 5% black. Atlanta was the second blackest city in the United States of America in 1920. At the end of the decade, it remained the second blackest city by proportion in the United States of America. In the 1930s, people loved talking about all these other cities, but there was only one, every major city had a black newspaper. There was one city in the United States of America with a black daily newspaper. It was Atlanta. Eventually, the person who owned the one daily black newspaper in Atlanta bought, in the Great Depression when newspapers were struggling, he bought a series of newspapers across the United States and created the first black media empire. The first black-owned and programmed radio station was in Atlanta, right? You have all these things. And so at a certain point, Dr. King had witnessed up close this black, what we now call black excellence, right? He saw black people that owned things. He saw black people that did things. He was enveloped in a space that was exclusively black. But I'm going to jump up a little bit to tell you guys about the first major case of gentrification in Atlanta, right? And I find that most people think of gentrification, they think of whites moving into a community of color and pushing people out, right? I know people who are way smarter than I am, they believe that. Almost, I would say 98% of the people I know think that's how gentrification is. Turns out in 1964, there was a white researcher in Britain researching the process of high socioeconomic status people moving into working class, what we call low socioeconomic status, SES, low SES communities. And this is white on white gentrification. And she coined the term gentrification. So gentrification had never been, from its conception, inextricably tied to race. It had never been about race, it was about class. Americans, I find, have a very difficult time grappling with class and extricating class and race. We kind of collapse lazily whiteness with affluence, blackness with not being affluent or being poor. And so it's really hard to imagine black people gentrifying a white community, but you can't do that, right? And it happened in Atlanta. It happened in Atlanta on a scale that has never happened anywhere else in the United States of America, certainly at that time. We're about to read about it. This is King's Atlanta with Dr. King. And keep in mind that King was born in 69, born in 29, died in 68. His entire life was spent in Atlanta except for about 14 years when he was out doing other things, other places. So now let's read about how black people created this gentrified situation. Then we're gonna open it up, right? I'm over time, I'm messing up. Okay, I'm not gonna hold y'all that long. I know y'all probably tired of me talking all this, man. All right, so so you probably know this is in many ways a good thing. In World War II, the United States government said we need to do something to the veterans who are giving everything they have to this war effort. We need to create, FDR said, a GI Bill. And the GI Bill said we're gonna do 3 critical things to the people who are giving everything. Keep in mind, I tell my students this all the time. What do you do for a living, sir? You're a student, right? Do you have a part-time job? What's that? J. Crew? Okay. So imagine in 1942, you have a young man working in a clothing store. He wakes up, goes to a clothing store, he might have a job, but all of a sudden I go to him and I'm, what's your name? I'm like, Terrence, I want you to literally kill people or die, right? Trying. And that's a lot to ask of someone, right? Who ordinarily might be selling clothes. Or might ordinarily be, I used to work at, I delivered pizza, right, when I was young. I worked at TJ Maxx when I was in college. I wasn't trying to kill people. I wasn't trying to go out and just not murder, but in war, go kill people. It's a big demand to human beings to be called upon to literally kill other human beings and keep doing it and to deal with that. It was such a sacrifice that the government decided that they wanted to do something very substantive to those people who were returning. And they decided to say, what are the 3 things that are most critical to these people? And they understood health was very important. They didn't call it PTSD yet, but they were like, we need to provide health care, right? We need to provide the basics, like housing. And then they said the cherry on top will be education. Imagine if Terrence could go to college, which had been a space for really privileged people. Not just to go to college for a discount or a grant, but literally for free. And the GI Bill, as beautiful as it sounds, as noble as it sounds, was not going to pass Congress. Southern Democrats, the president himself was a Democrat, he was from New York, Southern Democrats said, we support it as long as we make it for white people only. And FDR was like, I'm gonna cut to the chase here, but there had to be a compromise. So he said, okay, what we'll do is, ultimately we'll pass it, but we will put a clause in there. So if you come to the state of Florida and you served and fought your heart out and maybe your arm got blown up or maybe not, or you got traumatized by war and you want to get a chance to actually get a college education, you could get a college education, but you'll go to a black college, right? You go to a school that will admit you. So they worked around it that way. If you need health care, you'll go to a hospital to accommodate Negroes and a wing, the Negro wing, right? But when it came to housing, they were like, well, do we just tell? Because legally, in the 14th Amendment, you can't create a law saying we're going to give this to some people, not others. So you can get housing, you get education, you get health care. But when it came to housing, it was a tricky issue. And even Northern whites were struggling over this idea of the GI Bill. And they said, well, let's make this deal here. Let's not say black people can't move into a white neighborhood, because that would be in violation of the 14th Amendment. Let's say that nobody, period, white, black, Asian, Latino, Native American, nobody could move into a neighborhood under the GI Bill with guaranteed support from the federal government if you disrupt the racial integrity of that neighborhood. So this meant that the only Native American who ever get a loan was one going to a suburb that was full of Native Americans, right? If it was a new suburb somewhere outside of LA that was all Native American, you were good. Otherwise, hey, don't get mad at me. So it turned out that suburbia developed in the United States was exclusively white because black people couldn't go in and do that. People didn't have the resource to have black banks, black developers, black architects, black everything to create and carve out a whole big black suburb, except for King's hometown. And let's see how that happened. So this actually is a really fascinating story because the national chapter, the national leadership of the 2 largest civil rights organizations, the NAACP, they actually said the local chapter was quote unquote anti-NAACP because they did not push for integration hard enough. And then eventually in 1973, they suspended the entire chapter of the NAACP because they opted for black control of institutions rather than integration into a white-controlled institution when it came to the school board. In the 1950s, the Urban League, the National Urban League, they looked at Atlanta's Urban League chapter and said, you guys are not pushing for integration hard enough. We all are sitting on your hands. You should be asking these white people to sit next to them and be next to them and hang out with them. And they were like, all right, okay, we'll see what we can do. So this is what happened. The local chapter of the Urban League came up with something called Project X. In the early 1950s, African Americans definitely put into motion, quote unquote, Project X, with the help of local black leadership, including the Atlanta Urban League, to create the largest, most extensive, upscale black suburban development in the country. In the post-war period, the city of Atlanta had two real estate boards, the all-white Atlanta Real Estate Board and the all-black Empire Real Estate Board. In 1946, the president of the former told its members that they were, quote, under obligation not to sell to Negroes in predominantly white areas. However, the Black Real Estate Board largely partnered with its white counterparts to seek ways to make separate but equal more than rhetoric. The constant threat of violence when moving into a white neighborhood made the effort unattractive for many African Americans, although many took the risk. Black people had their pets killed, their homes were firebombed, properties were burned down to the ground, and people were physically assaulted in their blocks. Many African Americans were worried about moving into a neighborhood and being integrators. Simultaneously, the neighborhoods for which African Americans were forced to live, often lacked modern amenities such as paved roads, sidewalks, street lights, and access to green space. The houses were often older, smaller, and in high-density areas. As with many efforts in Atlanta, the black community supported the Empire Real Estate Board, opted to use its own resources to realize its needs. They opted for Afro self-determinism. Grace Towns Hamilton, the head of the Atlanta Urban League, and the group's housing director, Robert Thompson, worked with white authorities to access quote-unquote Negro expansion areas where black residents could obtain housing. I'm gonna skip all the details here, but there was this loophole that you can get support from the federal government as long as you did not subvert the racial integrity of the neighborhood. There was an area in Southwest Atlanta that had largely farmland, but there were a few white houses in the area. The area is called Collier Heights. I don't know how many people are familiar with Atlanta. Anybody here familiar with Atlanta? So Collier Heights, if you're familiar with Collier Heights in Southwest Atlanta, we'll hear what happens at Collier Heights. So they identified this area in Collier Heights, and the newcomers decided to buy swaths of land through a black development company called the National Development Company. And they didn't hide that they were black owned, but they made no fanfare about it when they started to purchase hundreds of acres of land all of a sudden. It was like when you hear the stories about Walt Disney just buying like thousands of acres of land, in Central Florida, and people are like, what's going on here? And all of a sudden, this company was buying thousands of acres of land, and people didn't really know what was going on. The initial purchase of large swaths of land was done without much fanfare, yet in order to manipulate white fears at a certain point, they revealed themselves more explicitly to be black. The idea is that it will all of a sudden encourage the whites to flee the area, right? They'll be like, oh my God, these are black people, and they'll just leave, and you could get the rest of the houses. The black newcomers were generally wealthier than the white ones who lived in Collier Heights. However, class proved to have little effect in the mitigating anger of black families constructing, quote, modern, gleaming new middle-class homes, unquote. The black newcomers proved to be one of the earliest waves of gentrifiers in Atlanta, if not the first. Despite widely conceived notions of gentrification, just whites moving into black neighborhoods, it folds out mostly in intra-racial ways. Class is the defining feature of the process, not race. The influx of higher SES black families raised the real estate prices in Collier Heights. The black gentrifiers, black developers, home buyers, and banks purchased 1,000 acres west of a holdout white neighborhood in 1953. A local white homeowners association argued that, quote, it was a moral issue to resist open housing and demand that white neighbors continue to hold the line, unquote. The White Southwest Citizens Association appealed to whites not to sell their homes to black families. Quote, we ask you, as a fair-minded individual, to refuse to make a fast dollar at the expense of the majority in this always white community, unquote. In 1954, however, all 135 white-owned holdouts sold, relinquishing the area to the National Development Company, making Collier Heights the largest upscale black suburb in the United States of America. The process of black on white gentrification was profound. Home prices in the area doubled, as higher SES black newcomers built in the area. By the mid-1950s, in the middle of the mid-1950s is the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, just to give you an idea. This is how early this was. In the mid-1950s, when the area was entirely black, homes averaged between 22,000 and 50,000. That's 243,000 and 550,000 in today's dollars. $250,000 to $500,000 in the mid-1950s, adjusted for inflation. Ultimately, the effort was successful for Project X's planners. Robert Thompson, perhaps the most central agent in the process of black influx, called it both a leapfrog and a military-style pincer move. Many of the homes had pools, recreational rooms, large yards, and patios. Some had tennis courts and basketball courts. Collier Heights had become 4,000 acres of Afro-subdeterminist success and black housing development, unprecedented anywhere in the United States of America. So this is Dr. King's hometown. And so Dr. King saw what we call black excellence all the time. So what does this have to do with how Dr. King ideologically evolved towards the end of his life? In 1966, there was a major fissure in the black freedom movement and the civil rights movement with the call for black power. There was a march in June of 1966. At this call, individuals from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, group of people around your age, they said, we now call for black power. And they changed the tone of the movement. Dr. King was at the rally. He got up at Greenwood, Mississippi, and he got on the stage, hey guys, no. We don't want black power. We don't want green power, blue power. We don't want any of that. We want freedom now. And the people who supported King, they started chanting freedom now, freedom now. Others started chanting black power, black power. This fissure had emerged. Dr. King was very clear. We do not want black power. It connotes separatism, nationalism. We don't want any of that kind of stuff. We believe in racial reconciliation. So King was very clear. I believe in racial reconciliation. That was 1966. Fast forward to late 1967, black power spread like wildfire. Young African Americans love black power. They were like, this is great. I feel good. I love being black. And people have been calling themselves Negroes and colored and all that. But they talked about the joy of seeing this term black is beautiful, an idea that your hair was okay, that God made no mistake when he made black people, that black people had good hair when that hair was natural and kinky. And there was something that seems very basic and quotidian for us today, but this was novel for people who literally put skin whitening ointment on their faces and grown men straightening their hair to approximate Richard Nixon's hair, right? So people are like, I want to look like Richard Nixon. I'm gonna get some toxic ointment to whiten my skin and then straighten my hair, right? So this seemed bizarre to black people as black power continued to spread through the community. But also there was something very powerful about saying that our institutions, our spaces are not inferior, right? That I could be an Alpha or an AKA and my fraternity or sorority is not inferior because it's majority black, right? That I could go to Morehouse or Spelman and my educational experience is not inferior just because there are no whites there. That there seems to be something more important for us, like access to resources than just sitting next to white people. And that seemed to be something that continued to grow in popularity. But also, Dr. King he affirmed and continued to affirm his belief in racial reconciliation. He said, I firmly believe, and he said this, I'm quoting him directly, he said that we need to remind ourselves there are whites to see ourselves free as much as the Negro is willing to, or is dedicated to free himself. He talked about this all the time. But I'm gonna cut to the chase. When all this was going on and people tried to move into white neighborhoods, they had people were being killed and people being blown up and beaten and all this. And then there was this process known as white flight. So Dr. King started to kind of change a little bit. And then his last speech to his organization was in Atlanta in 1967. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, was in Atlanta, headquartered in Atlanta, like SNCC was headquartered in Atlanta. And there in Atlanta, where he has seen all these black institutions for a long time and has seen all this black excellence and seen all the capacity for people to do all sorts of amazing things, but he also saw the infusion of money and support into black businesses, he got up and said this speech in Atlanta. At the very last time he spoke to people in the SCLC in 1967, he implored them to imagine a world where things were a little different. He said that in 1967, he said that he had a new take on the vain efforts to achieve residential integration in cities. Forever the believer in racial reconciliation, King began his commitment by saying that he firmly believes in racial reconciliation. He believes in the humanity of all people. However, this is what Dr. King said, They're pinning us into central cities. We're hemmed in. We can't get out. What are we going to do if we just control the central city? What if black people got control of a city like Atlanta? What would it look like? What would a city look like if white flight continued and we somehow use the resources in that city to build institutions in that city for the people who live in the city? He said, we've got to be the mayors of those big cities. And the minute we get elected mayor, we've got to begin taxing people who work outside of the city and live in the suburbs. I know that sounds mean, but I just want to be realistic. And so when King talked about this, he also talked about the power of people supporting black businesses. And he said the spirit of black power itself was tethered to this idea that I call self-determination, and King had been influenced by it. And although this was not unique to Atlanta, African Americans have forged these institutions all across the country. It was particularly acute in his hometown. He was enveloped in it. He was enveloped in this since birth. He sat in no classroom with a white student until he was in graduate school. The professors, department heads, deans, college presidents, ministers, and others who shaped his life were black people. He saw black business people, physicians, and lawyers throughout his childhood. They all led black institutions and achieved comfort in a rich cultural space. He was a member of black social spaces, including 3 black fraternities: Alpha Phi Alpha, Sigma Pi Phi, the so-called Boule, and the de facto fraternity of Morehouse. They were not deficient because whites were not present. He extrapolated. There could be practical power in black people controlling cities that whites had abandoned. Racial reconciliation was still a good thing, but black advancement did not require whites to be present. In August of 1967, less than a year before his assassination, he addressed a national conference, the National Convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And in the headquarters, he argued that African Americans should work very hard to cultivate resources to be funneled into black businesses. He told a story about in Cleveland, Illinois, they were able to get to a dairy company that made large sums of money, millions of dollars of profits from black consumers. However, they hired no black people. They went to this dairy company and said, we demand that you put your money into black banks, into black institutions, put ads into black newspapers, build up black businesses. You could do this because I've seen it done before, right? He was referring to his experience in Atlanta. And he knew what this would mean to build up black institutions in a way. He said, the ghetto is a domestic colony and is constantly drained without being replenished. This is the direct quote from Dr. King. And he knew that something different could happen. And he said to the applause when he said that we need to build these institutions that can benefit the people in very important economic ways. This is the power, and the emphasis is his, this is the power of Operation Breadbasket, his new plan. And this meeting in Atlanta drew thousands of locals. Perhaps some of those in attendance will convey the power of King's politics to those who would hold office in the next few years. Maybe those who would control contracts with the city were in attendance, captivated by the power of King's new strategies and programs for the development of black economic power. Whether they were there or not, the message gained traction across the national spheres of black politics. Increasingly, King's politics questioned economic justice. It was the cause of labor rights for sanitation workers that brought him to Memphis in April of '68, where he was struck down by an assassin's bullet. His body was returned to Atlanta. The funeral procession itself was unprecedented. There were people who came in from all around the world, politicians, including the major candidates for president of the United States in 1968, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Richard Nixon, Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The Academy Awards, you remember we started with Gone with the Wind. And I didn't say this here, but Gone with the Wind, Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to receive an Oscar for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. She was barred in Atlanta from all the celebrations when the premiere debuted in Atlanta, because Atlanta wouldn't allow, so she can go to any of the parties, she can go to the ball, she can do anything. None of the black actors could do any of that stuff in Atlanta. The Academy Award, when she did get the award, they gave her a little seat on the side away from everyone else. So she attended, got the award, but she was ostracized and put on the side from everyone else in Hollywood. In 1968, when King was assassinated, the Academy Awards was scheduled for the day before King's funeral. However, many of Hollywood's elite, including nominees like Sidney Poitier, did not attend because they were attending King's funeral. In an unprecedented move, the Academy postponed the funeral. Sammy Davis Jr., Marlon Brando, Eartha Kitt, Harry Belafonte, Paul Newman were among the many celebrities in attendance. James Baldwin, Nikki Giovanni, Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee, all joined other civil rights leaders in the services. Benjamin Elijah Mays, president of Morehouse College and mentor to Dr. King. King and Mays were so close, they made an agreement to give each other the eulogy for whoever went first. and he did this. And it's a very eloquent eulogy that Mays had. He says, "To be honored by being requested to give the eulogy at the funeral of Dr. Martin Luther King is like asking one to eulogize his deceased son. So close and so precious was he to me. It's not an easy task. Nevertheless, I accept it with a sad heart and with full knowledge of my inadequacy to do justice to this man." Dr. King died in 1968. 2 years later, after Maddox, this horrible, terrible governor, passed on, in 1969, there was a black mayor, a vice mayor elected, Maynard H. Jackson Jr. Eventually, he ran in 1973 and became the first black mayor of a major southern city, Maynard Jackson, when he became mayor of Atlanta. In 1973, Maynard Jackson came in 74, after he took the oath of office, he looked at the coffers in the city and the contracts. Turns out that the city of Atlanta, which at that point was about percentage-wise the same blackness it is now, about half black, a little over half black, over 99% of the contracts had gone to white businesses. So the same percentage of contracts that went to black people during slavery happened in 1970s, early 1970s. And Maynard Jackson took the principle that Dr. King said, when we get control of the cities, we need to start utilizing the resources of the cities at our disposal in the interest of the people in the cities. Maynard Jackson ended up taking that less than 1%, and ultimately when he left office after the second term, it got as high as 40%. When we talk about what Atlanta looks like today in 2024, it's all a direct consequence to what Maynard Jackson had set as a standard. And I'll conclude now by some quick visuals as we lead up to 2024 to give you an idea. We talk about Atlanta and the Imperial City. This is when the Klan was founded in the 1920s. This is when the little boy King was grinning, happy, singing slave at the premiere of Gone with the Wind, and all the black actors had been barred from entering. And this is when the city was the city too busy to hate. I skipped over this. We talked about all the numbers here. Atlanta had all sorts of international conferences and national conferences. Many people here are probably familiar with Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was the most famous American who was in France during World War II. She was an African-American woman who became really famous in France and Paris and then throughout Europe, but she lived in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. Josephine Baker, an incredibly talented, beautiful woman. She actually, during World War II, spied for La Resistance against the Nazis and became a hero, national hero in France. They have streets after her. They actually buried her recently, where they have the most celebrated French heroes throughout France's history. They put her body there in the last maybe 5 years. Josephine Baker was an international superstar. And keep in mind, I want to reiterate, she spied and fought against Nazis in the resistance, right? When she was so big, Atlanta wanted to bring her in to a concert. And she said, my contract won't allow me to sing to perform to segregated audiences. And Atlanta said, we'll make a deal. We'll let you come in and not be in a segregated audience, right? But when she got to town, no hotel in the city of Atlanta would let her come in. So she had to cancel it. And this is how deep Atlanta was. This is how hard, this is King's Atlanta, so you get an idea. So it's right here you see Atlanta is a fraud, this idea of the too busy to hate, and then why the hotels refuse to let people in. And this is Dr. Mays. And this is Dr. King at Morehouse College. Mays, who has shaped him in all sorts of important ways. And then we think about Black Atlanta. And in 1971, when Atlanta was dubbed the Black Mecca, if you look on the left, this is Atlanta Life Insurance Company. It's one of the largest black-owned insurance companies in the nation. It turns out that in 1970, this is a name that probably no one here has ever heard of. Norris B. Herndon was the CEO, president of this insurance company. The richest black person in the United States of America was this guy. And it's fascinating. Wasn't an entertainer, wasn't an athlete, wasn't Muhammad Ali, wasn't Barry Gordy. It was actually this guy that we have not heard of. And this is the scale of wealth and scale of success that people achieved in all black spaces with black communities, and King saw that. Norris Herndon gave money to King throughout the civil rights movement. I came across a letter where they asked King to speak to an insurance conference, and he said, you know, Mr. Norris, it'd be great, Mr. Herndon, excuse me, Norris Herndon. He said, Mr. Herndon, it'd be great if you give some money. He said, all right, King, I really appreciate all the work you do. Here you go. He gave him $5,000. I did the inflation. It's $50,000 in 2024 money. So this dude just broke him off a check, 50 racks, right off the rip. All right, this is the first mayor, the first black mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. He changed the game, and now Atlanta has the highest concentration of black-owned businesses in the United States of America, the highest concentration of black-owned schools, but also the highest concentration of black millionaires anywhere in the United States of America. And so much of this goes back to not only how it shaped King, but how King shaped the city of Atlanta. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. So we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. If anybody got a question online, the floor is open for questions. Do we have another mic? Oh, it's my turn. There we go.
Yeah. Hello, you hear me? Yeah, I was gonna ask, would you say that Dr. King is satisfied with the current state of race? And if he is there more to be done?
Yeah, I think there's no way he would not be surprised and struck by the great strides we've had, right? I was telling some students that to look at the United States now and not appreciate the strides is really to be ignorant of the history, right? Because, I mean, to not just be, heads of corporations, but let's look at raw numbers for regular people who are not the presidents of Ivy League universities or CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, or mayors of the biggest cities, or governors or senators, or president of the United States. Let's look at regular people. So life expectancy for black people actually should be significantly more than it is, but is higher than it's ever been, right? The infant mortality rate is the lowest it's ever been in the history of the United States, right? So that and everything in between, you could scientifically measure the progress. But he would be wildly disappointed at all the other chaos and foolishness we're still confronted with, right? And I can't imagine that King would look upon the world and be satisfied with what he sees, but there's so much room. But I always say that if we sort of deny the fact that we made progress, we in many ways impugn the activities of our ancestors who made such sacrifices, right? And so to say that we haven't made progress is to assume that all the names that we mentioned today, all that was for naught, and we know better, right? So we made progress, but we're certainly not where we want to be.
Quick note, after following this is a reception to IBC, so y'all better get there before I get there. I'm just saying, so go straight from here, go straight to IBC, because when I get there, y'all in trouble. Just so y'all know, all right? Any other questions? Okay. Oh. Yeah. Nah, you being thing. I got you. I'm Oprah.
I just had a question about if you had any books you would recommend to learn more about the history of black circular economies.
That's a great question. I do not have anything. There's a book, a big, giant, thick book. Dave, Theodore, that book, Black Power. Remember that big? It's a big black book. Theodore something.
I have to Google it.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You see, yeah. So that book talks about economic power in the black community, but I've only seen it, so I can't say if it's a good book or not. Yeah, so I wish I could say something more about it. I've heard, I see people. Yes, Theodore Cross. Yes. Yeah. Oh, you saw it too. Thank you.
Just Google.
There's one last slide. While we're getting that last question, this is the very last slide. Atlanta, that place that had once been the imperial city for the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, there are multiple statues of Dr. King throughout the city of Atlanta, and these are just three of the statues and one actually is in the state capitol. You got to keep in mind that the governor of Atlanta, governor of Georgia, had once been a Klansman, and Richard B. Russell, who stood against the civil rights and movement. That right there, you have this place that had once regulated so many oppressive things. And throughout the city of Atlanta, these amazing statues for its most beloved native son. Yep.
Question? All right, here we go.
Thank you. I just want to thank you, firstly, for this incredible presentation. So you're saying how towards the end of MLK's life, he was talking a lot about economic exploitation, the systemic racism, and everything. So for the average person here who may not be studying this, or for anyone in their daily life, how do you recommend that they go by each day to bring attention and to tackle this system that's been around for many years in this time when everything's good, you have these incredible meccas, these Fortune 100 CEOs and everything?
Yeah, so Atlanta, I can actually give you really good news and about Atlanta, but bad news also. So The bad news about Atlanta is that of all cities in the United States of America, Atlanta has the lowest percentage of social mobility. So a child born in a poor community in Atlanta has a 4% chance of ascending to middle class in her lifetime. So it actually has, despite all the rhetoric we have about Atlanta, it has this gapping chasm, a wealth gap. The thing that Atlanta's complicated because if anyone here, I'm sure, like especially all the black people here, have a friend or somebody who lives in Atlanta. Everybody has someone. But if you ask them, where do you live? They're like in Stone Mountain, Lithonia, Decatur, stuff like that. So Atlanta Metro, if you look at social mobility, the metro area drops from number 1, the worst social mobility, to 227th. So it's actually very good. The metro area is excellent for social mobility. The question though is like, we can't ignore people who are born in impoverished conditions in the city of Atlanta, and what sort of interventions do we make? So we can't just celebrate what we've done, but we also think about these huge chasms that still exist. And I mean, personally, I'm run out of time. I think that I believe in all sorts of things. One of the things that I firmly believe in the state of Connecticut, we try to have what we call a baby bond. So every single child who's born, not just, although I think poor children born in poverty should get more than children who are born in millionaires, right? But every single child who's born is given a small amount of money, like $100, $500. I think in Connecticut we did $500, which then matures over 18 years, right? So that person has, over that period of time, they have money for college, and you can use that money for college. And this is one of the interventions that people say for the wealth gaps we have, that at birth, in this way, everyone gets it, because haters are gonna be mad if you just give it to poor people, right? But if you give it to everyone, just all black people, only, so if you give it to everybody, then like, I got $500 even if I'm a millionaire, but it doesn't mean as much for millionaires. Maybe hostile to it if you don't give them some money though, So that's one of the things I think would be important for the interventions, for the racial chasms and class chasms that exist in the country. And there's so much to be said about that, but I think that's one substantive intervention.
What I have to say is not so much a question, but to say thank you, to piggyback on what my young sister just said, to thank you very, very much for taking this approach to bringing this information to us. It's what we refer to as, I would say it's the existentialist approach, the historicist approach, something St. Clair Drake used. And I would say to our students, take particular note of this approach, because it is especially important in this time. The only way to know where the dirty water in the stream is coming from is to go upstream to understand it. And so in this particular time, and if I dare to go there, in this particular political climate that we're in, where we are being encouraged not to look back at the past, you cannot understand the present or know where to go in the future without understanding the past. So on that note, Doc, I want to thank you, and I want to say to our students, pay particular attention to this, because it is this type of knowledge, understanding how Dr. King became Dr. King, which will also help you as an individual to become your best you. Everything around you, as Doc said, your whole circumstances around you will reflect and influence who you become. Thank you very much again, Doc.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
All right, we got one more question. None online? Where? Who has a question?
Would you believe that black collectivism exists within black culture as it did back in the era of Dr. King?
Okay. Yeah, the question of black, so the support of black businesses and so on, right? Is that what you mean? The kind of circular economy that the young man mentioned earlier? Okay. Yeah, so Dr. Ken and I will talk about this as historians, that we often romanticize the extent to which black people had all these businesses back in the day. And I'm always looking at macro numbers. I'm looking at, because we could have a number, we could quadruple the number of black billionaires and not change the black poverty rate, right? And so the selective sort of upper strata is one thing, but I really think about what's the macro effect. And so I think that even if we had there are more black businesses now than before, right? And black businesses now, unlike back then, we're not limited to closed communities where in Atlanta they have all these businesses. We have white patrons and non-black patrons and so on. So I think that black people the businesses themselves do not rely almost exclusively on black clientele like they did 60 years ago and back. But more importantly, I'm really looking at the unsexy meat and potatoes of black life and human life in general. I mean, I'm looking at the life expectancy, the chance of a baby that a baby will live, that we have health care, that people are not imprisoned. I mean, I'm looking at all these sorts of data, and those are the things that I think these macro issues really are affected by public policy, very importantly. But supporting black businesses and institutions, I think, is a good thing. But I think policy will help do that as well. Thank you for that. Great
Okay,
question.
so let's give Dr. Okbar a hand.